Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations About Horror. I am, as I usually am, Katherine Troyer, and joining me is Anthony Tresca.
Hi there. Hi.
I liked, the pause, like you were confused.
Well, I was considering if it was worth it to try and join in on that bit that you were doing, and then my mind didn't work quite
Yeah,
fast enough.
you weren't
So
fast enough.
I just was like, okay, I guess I'm just going to say hi twice, and that's the joke.
Yeah, puns don't count if they don't happen immediately.
No.
They have a short pun life.
It's true.
So this is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so thankful to have you back yet again for our discussion on 2007's The Mist.
So this is the last film that is part of our sort of COVID collection, if you will, of films that we thought for various reasons were timely because they were touching on things and concerns that are pressing down and weighing on us. And what better way to distract yourself than to be reminded in cinematic form of all the darkness in the world around you. And if you listened...
It's true.
It is
It's
true.
true.
And if you listen to our last episode on 28 Days Later, you'll know that we found that breaking point for Anthony where he found the film that was a little too close to home.
Yeah, it was definitely that one. It was not this one. I'll go ahead and give some of my initial thoughts. It's not this one. I was not spooked in quite the same way as I was when I watched 28 Days Later.
And that makes perfect sense because there's a nihilistic nature to 28 Days Later that I think very few films are capable of achieving. And The Mist, despite its ending, just I don't think goes to that same place.
Yeah, for a Stephen King adaptation, though, we've talked about Stephen King being remarkably affirmative, ultimately. While a lot of bad things happen throughout the text, ultimately, it's usually all kind of resolved by the end. This is kind of a darker take on that. It's not exactly the same, but still, it didn't hit me in the same way as 28 Days Later.
And of course, I think we have to acknowledge that one of the reasons that there's an element that is un-Stephen King-esque is because of the intrusion of Frank Darabont, right?
It's true.
And the fact that he is giving us a different ending than Stephen King's, which is going to be that more sort of traditional, but it's okay. We've escaped the monsters now. The badness is gone. We can return back to a good place. That's not where Darabont takes us at the end of this film.
Yeah, not quite.
Yes. So I did want to mention, because we often, throw these terms around of affirmative and disaffirmative. And again, we owe so much credit to Linda Holland Toll for giving us that framework to wrestle with. But although we often talk about disaffirmative films, or we sort of casually say, like, Stephen King really has a more affirmative stance, I thought it'd be a nice place to begin with just actually hearing what Stephen King has to say about horror films, about horror literature, and why he thinks it matters.
So yeah, I guess it's finally time we give a voice to Stephen King after dunking on him in a bunch of other previous episodes, and even going as far as to say affirmative things cannot be scary.
Yes. And I would like to say, every time I say that, I feel like I'm, gonna burst into spontaneous flames, right? I feel like one should not be allowed to disagree with Stephen King without paying some sort of hideous toll. But the truth is that when I think of horror, I don't think of the end of Stephen King stories. Certainly some of the middle stuff is some of the most haunting things, right? Having your foot cut off because of your number one fan, terrifying. Finding out the hotel that you were occupied in is being shared by ghosts, including, gross, wrinkly people from the bathtub, terrifying. But the ends.
Which is, yeah, and that's the place where King is often most faulted.
Yes, it is. And that makes sense, right? Because he's trying to to offer us ultimately this sort of affirmative stance. And it really does go back to his opinion about what horror is and what horror should do. And so I wanted to just read a couple quotes from him. The first is from an essay that originally appeared in Playboy, as all good essays should, because sometimes people do read the articles, right? And is then thank you, I needed your laughter there. And is now in his book Danse Macabre, which is a fantastic book. So he has a piece.
It is a good book. It's just, I didn't know that it started in Playboy magazine.
Yeah, in a January 1981 issue, and like it just cracks me up because
now introducing the latest academic journal, Playboy magazine.
I know. I mean, I just can't, like, somebody out there truly did get that issue for the article. So he has this piece called "Why We Crave Horror Movies," and he talks about the fact that we go to have fun. And then he says, but what kind of sickos are we for having this fun? And of course it's, real like winky, because I think the number one question he gets asked, actually I know because he said in interviews before, is like, what's wrong with you, or what bad thing happened in your childhood? And he says that for him, really what it comes down to is that, he says, and this is a quote, "The mythic horror movie, like the sick joke, has a dirty job to do. It deliberately appeals to all that is worst in us. It is morbidity unchained, our most base instincts let free, our nastiest fantasies realized. And it all happens, fittingly enough, in the dark. For these reasons, good liberals often shy away from horror films. For myself, I like to see the most aggressive of them, Dawn of the Dead, for instance, as lifting a trap door in the civilized forebrain and throwing a basket of raw meat to the hungry alligators swimming around in that subterranean river beneath. Why bother? Because it keeps them from getting out, man. It keeps them down there and me up here. It was Lennon and McCartney who said that all you need is love, and I would agree with that, as long as you keep the gators fed."
Yeah, so I mean, that's basic. He's like, it's okay to indulge your vices and acknowledge the deep darkness that exists within all humanity, but as long as you know that that's where it stops. It has to stop right there.
Yes.
You can acknowledge it, but that's not where you should really live and dwell.
Exactly. And I think, like you said, because for him, he sees horror as serving as an ability to compartmentalize. Right?
Yeah.
And of course, if you've read or seen Dr. Sleep, this is an idea that he comes back to, this idea of having a place in your brain where you can store all the badness. But we also see that at some point, the badness has the potential to trickle out.
Yeah, it really is. Stephen King kind of used horror as escapism. It's truly just like a singular, closed experience that as soon as you get to the end, that's it. You're done.
So I agree with the idea of it being a sort of closed experience, but I disagree a little bit, because I think one of the things that he's saying that makes horror so important is that we're constantly feeding it, right? Like, I think that we have to keep in mind that it can't be a one and done, right? It can be a closed experience.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly. No. I think we agree on this.
Yes.
I think we're saying the same thing. I should have been like, I should have elaborated just a touch more. It's like, you don't just finish. That's why you have horror fanatics, because you can't just end the experience there. But the horror film itself is a singular experience, or the horror text itself, rather.
And I think honestly, it was just the word escapism. Like, every time I hear that, I just feel the instinct to like fight. And I would say that, like, while it can be a form of escapism, I think King is talking about the idea that, it's also necessary for us to not become monsters ourselves, which again is a sort of an affirmative way of approaching the genre.
Yeah, it's kind of like you can have just a little bit of the bad as a treat, as long as you promise you won't do a lot of the bad.
Right. And as long as you promise to keep doing it, just in really small doses, right?
Yeah, it's just like how you like. Oh, I've got a better metaphor now than escapism.
I'm very excited.
It's like how you could. It's like you can have a little bit to drink, but if you have any more than that, then it's really bad. You don't want to indulge it. But a glass of wine here or there, that's fine.
And not only fine, but actually potentially medicinally beneficial, right?
Correct. Yeah. You can do that, but it's the point where you have a dependency on it, and you're always going back to it where it becomes a deep, dark problem.
Yes. And I think, right, his argument about why we crave horror really aligns with what he feels is the sort of purpose of it. And so this is also from Danse Macabre, but it's from his discussion of a text we've already looked at, which is The House Next Door by Anne Rivers Siddons. And he said, and this is again a quote, "The purpose of horror fiction is not only to explore taboo lands, but to confirm our own good feelings about the status quo by showing us extravagant visions of what the alternative might be. Like the scariest bad dreams, the good creep show often does its work by turning the status quo inside out." And then he says very specifically, that right now he says, quote, "In an American society that has become more and more entranced by the cult of me-ism, it should not be surprising that the horror genre has turned more and more to trying to show us a reflection that we won't like, our own." And so again, right, this is a very, and I think this is really important because even though Darabont, made some really significant changes to the potential affirmative, disaffirmative nature of the film through the ending, so much of this film really does read as a, but don't worry, there are some good people out there, some people who are able to reason and to create rational and, relatable, whatever it might be, whatever phrase you want to use.
And also
frameworks.
the problem in the film is from disregard for the status quo. There is no more status quo. And so that's where the problems are stemming from.
Yes.
If everything had stayed as it was in this town, no problems. It would have been fine. But it's just because the status quo was upended. And this is like what he just said. It's the alternative to the status quo.
Yes, exactly. And, one of the things that I think, is really hard for a horror film to do effectively because it's asking a lot. But anytime a film can truly dismantle everything about the status quo, I think they have to go all the way to the foundation of the family unit, right? And the idea that we can't even trust the family unit. And again, that's not the case in this story, right? No. Thomas Jane's character is going
Classic
to be
family man. Exactly.
And he's going to be a good father figure. And, one of the adaptive differences is that in The Mist, we see that he, the character has had an affair with someone. And so he's a little less wholesome. In this version, right, patriarchy, the father figure is still the ultimate sort of godlike figure, right?
And Darabont talked about that because he was he cut that intentionally because he thought it would be too much to ask the audience to accept this flawed character. He didn't want to have to muddy the waters. He wanted to keep him as a very wholesome, always right kind of everyman.
And so I think, and we can talk about this more, but I think one of the potential flaws of this film is that you can see sort of two point of views at odds and at tension with one another, and that is that this film in many ways seeks to still be the affirmative story of King, but it has this major disaffirmative ending, and it's kind of it's pulling at itself, and I don't think it always does so. I don't think it always resolves, or maybe never resolves, that tension of those sort of two opposing forces.
I actually think I'm going to take a slightly different thing. I think that the ending, while being dark, is not disaffirmative. Because let's go ahead and discuss the change of the ending. In the novella that King wrote, they escape and they're driving off. And after they find refuge for the night, David is listening to the radio and he hears a single word broadcast, Hartford. And with that one shred of hope, he prepares to drive on into an uncertain future. And so it's very ambiguous as to what happens in the end. It's still kind of hopeful, though. Mm-hmm. It's like maybe they get out, maybe they don't.
And it's very familiar, right? It's no coincidence that in this article, that Why We Crave Horror, that King references Dawn of the Dead, because it's a very similar ending, right?
Right.
They're literally riding off into the sunrise, and that could be really good, or we could think about the fact that they don't have gas and there's a baby on the way, right? So again, I think that's a very effective way to offer hope, but to also fit within the reality of what's probably going to happen.
Yeah, and so I think that in the film ending, they it's obviously they lose that hope. They lose all hope, and so David then ultimately ends up killing the 4 people who are in the car with him, including his son, and then gets out to go be killed by the creatures. And then it's revealed that the army is there, and they were just, if he had just waited, held out hope for just a little bit longer, then everything would have been okay. And so while I think it's dark, obviously, because if he had just waited just a little bit longer, everything would have been fine. He wouldn't have had to kill his son. I don't think that it is disaffirmative, necessarily, because it's still quite an affirmative ending in that if he had just held out hope and believed in the status quo and that things would work out, it would have been rewarded. But it's because he turned his back on that and he lost hope, lost faith, whatever you want to say. We'll get back to the element of faith, obviously, later in the discussion. But it's because he lost that the story had to end that way. And so that's not a disaffirmative ending.
So I agree that the arrival of the military, right, and this sort of like proof that at the end of the day they've got us covered, right, or that the monsters are not going to win, and in theory, with the arrival of the military, we're going to lose some of our more extremist groups, right? They're going to sort of dissolve. I would say absolutely, in that respect, you could read it, the conclusion as affirmative. I am going to disagree, though, because for me, what I think is happening with the arrival of the military is not evidence that the status quo, the way things are, is a good way, and we can return to that. I read the ending a little bit more along the lines of, we have spent this whole movie trusting David to be the voice of reason because he's more educated, because he's a white middle-class male, because he's, this patriarchal father, almost savior figure. And I think, and I read the ending when he kills them, and then we have to see that he was wrong in his decision as a sort of like confirmation that maybe we shouldn't have been trusting this voice all along.
Well, so I can see that argument, but I don't know if it holds up, because I think that the time that the film says the film doesn't say that he was incorrect. In fact, he was correct. If they got out of the town, the military was right there, they would have been safe. It's the second that he turns his back on his belief system and this hope. I think that a big theme of the film is never giving up hope.
Right.
And the second that he gives up that hope and turns his back on the values that have been instilled to him as the patriarchal man, leader of family, and literally destroys his own family, kills that, is the second that it all turns bad for him specifically. So in that way, I think it's kind of a caution, maybe more of a cautionary tale, an affirmative cautionary tale.
Interesting.
Of what happens when you give up hope and you turn your back on the system. Because he was right.
Yeah, I mean, he was right, except for the one time that he was really, really wrong.
In killing. Exactly.
Right.
Right.
So, I don't know. I almost wonder if it can't be a little bit of both. If it can't, because you're making some really good claims. There's something about how that scene ends and how the film ends kind of in light of everything else that makes me feel like we have to wonder if we should have followed him all along, because does it matter if he was right if we're dead? And I mean, obviously we're not really there, but everyone in his party except for him died. I think that's it. If he had killed himself too, and then the military had showed up, I think honestly, for some reason, I would have seen that as more affirmative, because it would have been exactly as you said. He shouldn't have given up hope. Too bad he did, etc. But instead, we kind of have to see that, he's the only one that's making it out. He's the only one that's going to survive. And to me, that makes me question whether or not I should go with the status quo if it's going to ensure only the survival of those that are at the top. But I can see everything that you say. I simultaneously agree with. So I'm gonna have to say that I feel that, again, I'm gonna go back to the tension. I think it creates tension because too much of what the rest of the film is doing doesn't quite match where the end of the film goes.
Yeah. And so I think, yeah, I'm now I'm like, I thought that I liked the ending, but now I'm kind of thinking maybe I don't like the ending. Because I think you're right. I think it does kind of offer a bit of a muddled message as to what you're supposed to take away, which is not a terrible thing. It's forcing us to have this conversation and really think about it. But ultimately, it doesn't really come down either way, which is interesting.
And it's not necessarily bad. I think, it's not the ending that I have problems with. I think what it is that, we have a source material that Darabont was very attached to. And
this was his passion project. This was the film he wanted to make. He wanted to start by making this film.
But he also felt very strongly that the ending should be different.
Right.
And I'm going to go back to something we talked about a long time ago with Hereditary. And that is that I'm not sure the end showed its work, right? Like, I think that we needed the threads of the end to be tentacled and sort of woven into the film much, much more heavily for us to arrive at that conclusion and have it feel like it wasn't grafted on.
I agree. Now I think I agree with you. I think it's one of those classic twist ending just for the sake of doing a shock twist ending. And so it leaves you feeling shocked. Sure, it wasn't what I was expecting with my knowledge of Stephen King, and that he usually writes such affirmative stories that have affirmative endings that are cultural resets and just puts everything right back to the status quo and everything's fine and dandy. It was that one isolated incident that was the problem. And so it was shocking in that regard because it was so dark. Mm-hmm. And you could never, for this man in particular, go back to status quo and things would never quite be the same and good. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's a satisfying ending because I think what you're saying is right. It doesn't quite show its work enough to get you to that point. It just does that and is like, isn't that pretty good? That's a pretty good ending, right?
The weird thing is that I like the ending in that I think it's a better, for this type of story, for what I think the story wants to do or can do, I think it's better than the more ambiguous, riding off into the mist.
I think I think that ending would have felt trite. And
yes.
I think also that ending would have felt unsatisfying too.
Yes. But I am going to make one more argument for being disaffirmative based on something you just said. I think the other thing we have to remember is that David is also, as a character, now going to have to question the status quo that has said, as a white educated male, he has the answers, right? And his solutions, mm-hmm. his methods are going to be the right ones. And he has to spend the rest of his, fictitious life realizing that everything he's ever been taught about the sort of like natural rightness that is him is not the case. And certainly, I don't think he's gonna become a religious fanatic or anything like that, but I think the fact that our figure is gonna have to question whether or not his entire life, based on who he thought he was and his like integral role, it feels very placeless, right? I think he loses his sense of place at the end.
And I can definitely see that argument, but I can also see just a doubling down of it in him, because it's like, if I had only just stuck to my guns just a little bit longer, if I had only held out hope and believed in what I knew was right, because I can definitely see that argument playing out in his head. It was like, I was correct. If I had just kept to this and not given up, then it would have been okay.
It's true.
And so I think, that's why I think that, because I think David as a character is not quite as complicated as that ending warrants. I think you would have had to do some more muddying of the character. Like, I don't know, perhaps making him not so perfect.
Yes.
In order to be like, oh yeah, maybe he would realize now that everything he's been taught is a bit of a lie, but he has no reason to. He's a perfect, you said this earlier, Christ-like figure.
Yes.
Who is leading the non-believers and was right the whole time. And yeah, they died, but it's just because he gave up on the cause.
Yes. What would have been interesting, well, lots of things could have been interesting, but I think you're very right. Is there a term, what is the term that I can never remember? Susie, wait. What's the,
Mary Sue.
Mary Sue, thank you. It's a Gary Stew. There we go. Okay.
Gary Stew is the male equivalent of that?
I believe so. Let me double
Okay.
let me
they both sound
that.
silly, so I'm okay. It doesn't matter to me either way. Mary Sue, Gary Stew?
I think so.
Okay.
A Gary Stew, also called a Marty Stew. I like Gary Stew better. Is the
we'll stick with Gary Stew.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So, I think you're absolutely hitting the nail on the head in that his character, he really is, we often talk about female characters that are underdeveloped as being Mary Sue's. Well, he's the Gary Stew.
Underdeveloped and yet shown to still be like perfect in everything they try to do.
Exactly. And he's the Gary Stew, right? He's the male version. And I think that like that we have a perfect example here, right? In a film that he is by far the least interesting character.
For sure.
And when I think about why this film terrifies me, it has very little to do with him or his plotline, right? It really has to do with the religious mania and the like just mob mentality stuff. And you're going to get some of that when you have Thomas Jane as your actor, right? He's a very stoic actor. He's not known for emoting or micro acting, micro movements, right? He's very sort of,
yeah, it's a one-dimensional stock character. He's the lead. He's the male lead.
And I think what would be interesting, would be to kind of take that idea of, that, like you said, we have to see him wrestling with things earlier on, and I think if we played more with this idea of PTSD or postpartum depression, right, which wouldn't obviously mean we could have a male character, but something where we're wrestling with like, where is that line between what we know is cognitively correct versus emotionally right? And I think that if we had that kind of built into this, right, maybe he was an abusive father who was abusive only because he was super stressed at work, but now that he's not stressed by that, right? Like, I don't know, but if we'd somehow,
or if he had maybe cheated on his wife, like was in the original novella, and wasn't, just literally anything where he isn't just so perfect.
Yes. And so that makes it hard to see the ending, I think, as just disaffirmative, because we have to assume that despite his, quote, one mistake, which admittedly is a big one, right?
It's like, a huge mistake, obviously.
Yes. But it's like, despite this one thing, he's perfect otherwise, so we'll be okay, right?
That's why I think it's a cautionary tale then. It's like, just trust in the system. Trust in these values, and if this character had, everything would have been hunky-dory.
And I think for me, because I am a little bit, I can be a little bit of a sheep, right? Like, not so much like, I can be a little sheepy, right? Like, where I'm like, okay, well, this is the way it's always been. I think that's for me why I have to read this film as disaffirmative, because my natural instinct would be to go to him, right? Because he is educated and he is rational and he is a good father. And so for me, it has to be disaffirmative, because if I had gone with him, I would have for sure died, right?
Right.
Which is a really kind of interesting, but like we've said, very muddled way to end this film. And I think in part, we're going to talk about how we haven't even talked about the monsters, right?
I also think are the super uninteresting. They're the second least interesting characters in this movie.
That's so sad.
It's David and then the monsters from the mist, for me, are the most uninteresting characters and parts of this movie.
I think so. And I think that that it's because really what's more interesting, and lots of, monster theorists talk about this, like Stephen Asma, right? It's that monsters are really a symbol for human vulnerability and crisis, and they play roles in our thinking about our responses to menace. And the truth is that what is then more interesting than the monsters is how they are allowing us.
The human's response to the monster.
Exactly.
Like, exactly. And I think that is the most interesting part. You see, there are three movements that rise up in reaction to the monster. It's the one led by the lawyer, which is kind of this common sense prevails that monsters don't exist. Denial, just flat out denial. And you see what happens to them. There's the camp led by David, who is more of this is real, but there's a way we can get out of this. Mm-hmm. If we just keep our faith and we know what is right and good and just on how we treat other people, we can get out of this. And then there's the third camp that rises up, that is led by Miss Carmody, which is the more religious, Bible-beating, fanatic response to it. Yes. And the one that I think is the most interesting part.
It is.
She is my most interesting character for this movie, and I'm not alone. I know that's kind of what everybody thinks.
Yeah.
Every review I've read has been like, she's excellent. That's the best part of the movie. Everything I've looked at. So I know I'm not alone. That's not unique. I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yeah. So, Anthony knows more, but podcasters, you've probably picked up on the fact that I was raised pretty conservatively, and one of the sort of big discussions was end of times, and so I'm going to be scared of any end of times thing, just kind of because of my childhood, right. But when you couple that with this lack of rationality and a mob mentality, you're pretty much, if you had thrown in being accused of a crime that you hadn't actually committed, you would have hit all of my buttons, right?
All the things that you fear most.
Exactly. And I think that for me, what this film does so effectively is that it forces us to experience this sort of exponential crisis, right? Mm-hmm. And we start with one thing that I think is going to be very frightening to many people, and that is the sense of isolation. I can't remember her name, or the character now that she plays on Walking Dead, Carol. I can't remember the actress's name, but the woman who plays Carol on The Walking Dead has a small little part in this film, which makes sense because then she goes into be Walking Dead, which is also Darabont.
Yeah, one of his other babies.
Exactly. But there's that scene, right, where she decides that she would rather rush out into the mist to get home to her children than stay in the store and risk, being safe, but her children aren't. And so from the beginning, we have this something that I think is very disturbing, and that is, what do you do if the people that you rely on to help you make decisions, or the people that are in your trust, are away from you? And we start there, right? And then if you don't have your support system, your network of sounding boards, how easy would it be to be persuaded by religious mania, or by someone that is the opposite of that, right? But regardless, the moment that you start giving into those things is the moment a mob forms. And mob mentality, I think, is one of the most terrifying things, mm-hmm. period, because it's also one of the most real things.
It's all consuming.
Yes.
I agree. I mean, you can definitely see the influences from Lord of the Flies on this work.
Yes.
And that sense of just cult-like, unquestioning devotion to a cause, a core belief system, and anything where you don't question any part of it and you just wholeheartedly go full into it is scary.
And you don't even have to go fictitious, right? Salem witch trials, any lynching or mobbing that we have done repeatedly throughout history, the Holocaust, right? It is, there are too many real examples of situations where we have created this monster that is us, and it has no brain because it's too many brain. It's very disturbing.
And I was reading some things about this film and people's reactions to it, and a lot of people pointed out that it's this is what happens when humans are in groups together. And that's it. It's like the message of the film is that humans in groups are always bad. And I actually don't know if I necessarily agree with that analysis. I think I agree to it to an extent. I think that what this film is, and the novella obviously are really more talking about is like groups are not necessarily a bad thing. We need groups to survive. Everyone has groups that they rely on, like you were talking about, like whether that be their friends, their families. Religion is not necessarily a terrible thing.
No.
But it's groups in response to crises that can be the problem, particularly when the crises forces you to be like, you have to make a decision now because the world is at stake here.
Yes.
And so I think it is less of groups bad and more of when groups are put into really hard crises like this, it's a lot harder.
I mean, essentially this film is like proof for why group projects should not exist in schools, right? Because like everything you described, groups under stress, not with their natural support system, like that's group work at its worst. But I think you're right. I think what this film shows is perhaps we can differentiate between a group versus a collective, right? Or find some sort of term to differentiate between when you have something that is controlled by a charismatic power, or when everyone just sort of gives up control, or fights and things like that, versus a collective where if they had said, hey, good news, we have someone who can offer religious support, we have someone who can offer rationale, this person is going to bring in one of my favorite characters is the grocery store manager. I just thought he was kind of a nicely developed smaller character,
played by a good character actor. I love Toby Jones. He's a great little character actor.
Yeah, he is. And I think so, like, again, I think you're absolutely correct that it's not so much about humans or even a human group. It really is almost more, again, about this idea that perhaps the fault lies with a system that does not train us to know how to properly work in groups or to know how to properly deal with crises.
And I think crises often provoke extreme behavior.
Yes.
And falling into extremist camps on where it's like it's either all or nothing. I think you can see that even right now in terms of the COVID response. It's like we either need to be completely back open or completely shut down.
Yes. Those
are kind of like, if you dumb it down, those are the two positions.
Yes.
And if you're on the left and you see anybody who is going out into a park, even if they're social distancing and stuff, like, it's like, wow, look at these people, they don't care about anybody else. And if you're on the right, it's like all of these restrictions are just total government control, you're being manipulated, and you're a sheep and you're just a dumb follower.
Yes.
And there's no room for nuances in these situations.
And that's what makes it a perfect film to talk about now, right? Like, I'm so glad that you brought in that connection, because you're absolutely correct that, and we're seeing this, right? Independent of COVID, but COVID has, again, I'm going to make a terribly extended metaphor here. Much like the monsters in the mist, right? COVID-19 has essentially acted as an incubator, right? It's not that we haven't had these issues. No. It's that they are being incubated into this like yeast monster, right? That is growing like super large. This was a weird extended metaphor, I realize.
No, go for it. I love it. I love where it's going.
But you're right. That we are realizing that it doesn't make sense to have one side or the other. You can't have the rational and the emotional separate. You can't have, someone taking care of our practical needs and someone taking care of our spiritual needs, right? And keep them separate. That doesn't work, and that doesn't make sense. And so, we see that, right? We see that throughout the entire film.
Yeah. And it's not just a uniquely American problem either. No. You see this around the world, though around the world it is a little less. The left has a particular side and the right has a particular side. Sometimes they swap. It's just that it's more about the crisis promotes extreme reactions.
And it promotes seeing those extreme reactions as a fundamental part of your identity.
Yeah,
right?
And is totally justifiable.
Yes. Because we have people, equating their decisions in the real world with, whatever their thoughts are about COVID-19 reflects their thoughts about patriotism, right? Which and it goes so deep, and again we see that in The Mist, where it's not just that Mrs. Carmody is religious, right? Or that she believes that this is a sign. It's that is who she is at her core, right? And to think anything else, to have any other thought, would mean to have to be a different person, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that is, to me, that is one of the most terrifying premises.
You tie your sense of identity and being into this extreme belief. And I think this movie came out in 2007, so it's really interesting to see it it successfully predicted and captured this trend of the rise of partisanship and growing extremism that was around, obviously, in 2007, but it's really rearing its head from 2016 onward, and particularly now.
What is interesting, though, about reading this film as a metaphor for partisanship, and again, I think, like you said, it's really effective to do so. Again, though, it becomes really, squishy when we think about who the role that David is supposed to play in this, right? If he's supposed to be and I don't think he is, right? I think the problem is that it's easy to read him as the middle, right? As someone who has managed to incorporate both the emotional or not spiritual so much, but emotional and the practical, right? He dies, or his method leads to death, right? So there's this weird way in which this film does not tell us or let us see an option that is going to work.
And so in that way, I would actually say that this film might actually be more disaffirmative. If your primary reading of it is through this partisan lens, and you're like, that's really what the film is about. It's about how partisan behavior promotes particularly in times of crisis, leads to extreme partisanship, and even when you go in the middle, it doesn't work because the system as a whole is flawed. There's no right way to work within the system, whether you're extreme or in between these two extremes. I could see that if that's your primary lens of what you're in, if that is your primary lens of analysis for the film, then perhaps I could actually see it reading as disaffirmative.
Yes, I will take that as a win.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that.
Excellent.
But I think it could work. I don't see any reason why you can't do that. Can't be the primary lens of analysis that you do from this film, because it's so substantiated by the film itself.
One of the things we haven't talked about is the critical reception of this film, right? I assume it's probably not very high.
No, that's actually, it's mixed.
Okay.
It's not terrible. Critics actually, some say that this is what horror is supposed to be, and it's been put on lists of some of the best horror from the 21st century. Some people say that it is just a competently made, this is from Roger Ebert's review, it's a competently made horrible things pouncing on people movie. It's more of just a typical genre fare that doesn't rise above it. Rotten Tomatoes score, critic 72, Metacritic critic 58, Letterboxd score is a 3.5. So it's not terrible. It's just more of mixed. As time has gone on, however, the reaction to the film has gotten quite a bit more favorable, with people being like, it deserves to be revisited. It's actually quite good. It has some good stuff in it. So yeah, I don't know if that's quite the answer that you were hoping for.
Yeah, actually it is, because what I was thinking about was that before we started recording, you said that this wasn't, and that this film didn't do anything one way or the other for you. That wasn't wasn't the best thing you'd seen. It's certainly not the worst, but
no.
But and then you said that your big complaints are that the monsters are this, and the scenes with the monsters first don't really hold up, right? The special effects certainly don't, but also just the monsters are used for your absolute least favorite thing about horror, and that is the jump scares, right?
Cheap jump scares. Cheap. cheap
and
jump scares. They're not even good. They're not even good jump scares.
That's so funny. And you said that you also have some problems that you think that, you know, the film might be not crafting the complex enough characters that we have come to expect now, in terms of, you know, you're not going to be completely defined by, in large part, your socioeconomic status, as this film kind of tends to do.
Well, unless, and I said that, but that was when I was not using my primary lens of analysis of partisanship. So that problem I don't think holds up as much for me. But now it's just, my main problem is that is more of just what we're talking about the film. That is one thing that the film is doing, but a large majority of the film is dedicated to those cheap, monstery tentacle things. It's this weird, disgusting looking CGI. It was clearly before they were trying to do something more ambitious than what they actually could. And so much of the film is just that.
And I think that and I was hoping that you would kind of say that, because I think that one of the reasons that I like this film is that it allows for some of those deeper conversations, you know, even as it may fail, because as a monster film or as a creature feature, you know, that it offers enough other things to really redeem itself. And I think this is just a good example of, you know, a film being capable of more than perhaps it originally meant to be, right? Like, I know Darabont has said that, you know, this isn't really about the monsters outside, it's really about the monsters inside, the people you're stuck with, things like that. But I think that this film is a perfect example of the ways that you can offer this critical framework that I'm sure Darabont probably didn't have partisanship in mind, but this film becomes such a perfect framework for understanding these really complex things in a way that just makes perfect sense, because it's been stripped down to its most basic horrible level.
Right. And I think that's the best part of the film. And when it really is, when it's having those it's more of the conversations in this situation that I found worked really well and what I enjoyed about the film. It's just that there's only like 3 or 4 of those conversations where you can really kind of see that, and it's what we've based our analysis of the film on. But those moments are fleeting in the 2 hour and 5 minute runtime that is this film.
So for me, I think what's interesting is that they may be fleeting in terms of the screen time. But
excuse me, 2 hours and 6 minutes.
Oh, that's an important distinction.
I don't want to get fact checked. I don't want anybody to be like, it's actually 2 hours and 6 minutes.
And so everything else that you've said just can't be right.
Invalidated, yeah.
Uh-huh. But I think, you know, for me, when I think about this film, that's what I think about, right? Perhaps it's not occupying the primary screen time, but it is occupying my primary mental time. And based on what you said about other people, you know, finding Marcia Gay Harden as, you know, one of the better performances and things like that, it's what's sticking out in other people's minds too.
Yeah.
And
true.
so I think what's interesting is as this idea that we can have a film that perhaps meant to be something else, or is almost by effect something else based on screen time, but that's not what resonates.
Right. It's a film that doesn't know what it's about.
Yes.
It doesn't, or rather, excuse me, that's too condescending. It doesn't know what the most interesting part about the film is.
And what's interesting again is we do have, you know, Darabont saying, and this is a quote that he says, the story is less about the monsters outside than about the monsters inside, the people you're stuck with, your friends and neighbors breaking under the strain. I would say that it's not even that the film doesn't know what's the most interesting parts. I would say that it's a film that didn't have the luxury of being a horror film today, because it had to be a horror film in 2007 where we had to have the primary things and then we could sneak in our vegetables, right?
Yeah.
And
that's interesting. Yeah, that's probably more accurate. I think you're probably right. If this film had been made today, it may have been able to have been done on, like, for a real small budget, and that stuff outside in the mist would have probably only been alluded to.
Yes.
And really we would have seen a deep dive into the relationships.
And I think if Darabont had, because you said that it took him a long time to get this film approved.
Oh yeah, it took him 20 years.
That's insane. And he first had to do, like, win a whole bunch of...
Yeah, so he worked on 2 other Stephen King adaptations that were really successful. The Shawshank Redemption in 1994, and then The Green Mile in 1999.
Just little films, you may have heard of them.
Yeah, just a couple of Oscar-nominated films.
And then it was only after winning those awards that he was able to get this film greenlighted, right?
With the ending that he wanted. Because he really wanted this changed ending, and everyone was kind of like, I'm not really sure. You're going to have to change your ending that you have in the script right now. And he was like, nope, not going to do that. Not going to do it.
Whereas I think if he had presented that film today, or, in the last couple of years, they would have said only if you keep the ending that you've proposed, right? Mm-hmm. And like make it an even bigger deal. So I think that it's a product of its generic times. We weren't ready to go there yet, and now we are. And so that's what we focus on, right? To the film's credit. So up next is going to be a film that neither Anthony nor I are very big fans of, and it is the film we were originally planning to release as our next episode back before COVID, and that is
1973's The Exorcist.
So we look forward to you joining us for that episode, and in the meantime,
be sure to rate and review this podcast. It really helps us if you do both of those things. Share us with your friends, and all of our social media is linked down in the description below. Thank you for listening.